Hello everyone, welcome back to the SMITE support builds. Today we will be discussing both hunters in the support role and mages in the support role. The reason why I'm combining these two is because both of them are extremely squishy, so it can be very difficult, but a lot of the same rules apply to both of them. Alright, we've already discussed the items in pretty thorough depth, and at this particular point it's more of a matter of choosing the correct hunter or mage to support with, because there are some that actually can pull off the support role, and there are some that are just going to really let down the team in the end game because they won't be able to tank well enough, nor will they actually have the ability to really support that well. Alright, now, talking about hunters specifically as well, one other general rule for hunters very specifically is they do really well, for fairly obvious reasons, with animosity builds. So do keep that in mind, that you may want to emphasize a little bit more in line with HP. Building some attack speed is fine. Again, not necessarily something you're going to want to build all the time. If you have enough auto attackers that you can boost the attack speed of, maybe it would be better to build War Flag, for instance. Also, typically, as I was talking about with Arachne in the previous episode, a lot of these hunters can build just chin size and still have a decent amount of damage contribution to a fight. Or alternatively, they build Executioner, interestingly enough, because you're reducing the enemy's physical protections from range, and as a result, that actually can really help out your team. Alright, so those two particular items tend to be very good as your end game damage item if you choose to do that. Whether or not you do, I've seen all kinds of supporting. Actually, just earlier today, while I was just trying to grind E-set to Diamond, I saw a Mulan who basically was just playing a second support. Just she started in the duo lane instead. That was basically the only difference. Absolutely dominated that lane. We lost because the duo lane completely collapsed because they weren't expecting it. It wasn't really necessarily, I'm going to actually put out the story a little bit here, it wasn't necessarily that the Mulan playing a second solo lane is necessarily good on its own. That really hurts your team in the end game because you don't have someone properly tanky. By the way, her build was Talisman, Soul Eater. She was clearly going for the invincibility build, which I'll talk about in the next episode, where I want to talk about very specific builds. But she was trying to go for the invincibility build, but she made a mistake in the late game, but by that point it was too late for us. Our duo lane had already collapsed. I was getting slapped as a result because Mulan was free to wander over. It was pretty ugly, but it was more of a matter of my duo lane was just too surprised by this to be able to adapt fast enough, and that is the benefit. That is actually a prime example of the benefit of playing something really surprising. Okay, whether it be a surprise support pick, a surprise ADC pick, anything. The element of surprise can carry you surprisingly far, and in this meta where it is possible to snowball, it can really pay dividends. Again, it is a risk because if you fail to snowball, you're pretty much doomed. That's the interesting thing about this meta, and this is actually why I was talking last episode about the Gauntlet of Thebes viewpoint, where basically you have to decide, do I want to go for that early game aggression and try to snowball, or do I not want to take that gamble, go for Gauntlet of Thebes, play it safe in the early game, and then bring in a little bit of damage later on? That's the question you have to ask yourself with Gauntlet of Thebes. However, Gauntlet of Thebes on hunters, at least, from my experience, is not a great idea. I have never personally gotten it to work particularly well, mostly because of how squishy hunters and mages are compared to the other three classes. Even assassins are slightly tankier at baseline than hunters are. Alright, and mages have the worst baseline protections of all five classes. You generally aren't going to have the time to use a Gauntlet of Thebes at all, unless your ADC is an Izanami, or a Sylvanas, quite literally. And even then, I still wouldn't risk it. You are a hunter ADC. You are a hunter support. You have unusually good early game damage, particularly if you pick very specific hunters. You have the ability to aggress. Use it. Use it in the early game. Now, I've seen some. It's not like this is a foreign concept if you've been playing the game long enough. Actually, just yesterday I saw a Danzaburou in the support role, and that's actually not a bad support pick. He did okay for himself. Now, this is mostly due to his abilities. His passive means very little, other than giving him bonus gold, which does help, by the way. If you play a Danzaburou support and you want either War Flag or Animosity, the usual downside of going for the Animosity or the War Flag start is a lower gold amount. However, because of dubious savings, this isn't as much of a problem. So Danzaburou as a support is unusually interesting in that he can utilize War Flag or Animosity without the downside of decreased gold income. Granted, if you play badly or you goofy or early game, you're still going to have a hard time recovering from that, but at the end of the day, you still have the ability to recoup the losses that you would normally have by not building Sentinel's Gift. So already right off the top here, while the physical power boost means nothing to you as a support, that gold from dubious savings is surprisingly very useful in the support role. Alright, now that we've talked about that Fool's Gold, these bags intoxicate. Now, intoxicate isn't my favorite crowd control. I've talked about this before, you know this. But it's still a form of crowd control, and if you're fond of intoxicate as a crowd control, or you're really confident in the abilities of your allies, which, if you're partying up with people, that you're more likely to be confident about it, then that's not really an issue. But this intoxicates. This is a taunt that also happens to heal you a little bit, which is really nice for the support role. Again, you can last a little longer in fights. And Tanuki Trickery, this is a really interesting one, because it reduces your basic attack damage. Now, that might sound selfish, and to some extent, yes it is. I'm not going to argue that, but keep in mind that you can also use this to even more effectively body block shots. Okay? This is unusually useful from a support standpoint for the same reason as dubious savings. This approached, I can't speak today, approached the correct way, this can be really useful from a support standpoint. Again, the standpoint here being body blocking. Finally, his Uproarious Rocket stuns. So literally everything Danzaburou brings to the table, even including his passive, has a really good use within the support role. So Danzaburou can actually play the support role pretty well, which surprises a lot of people. And if you want to play a support ADC, I would recommend going to Danzaburou. Again, I would really emphasize and lean on either the War Flag or the Animosity starter item, depending on which, depending on how many auto attackers you have on your team. Alright? So you have that. However, I must warn you that you are generally... You're still going to have to play a little bit safer in the early game, because you aren't going to have that gold. You are going to be trying to, go for the long game here. You also might be tempted to go Mannequin Scepter. If the enemy team has a lot of auto attackers, this can work, but I've generally found it to be less effective overall compared to either War Flag, which directly boosts your allies, or Animosity, which does more meaningful damage. There has to be a pretty substantial physical damage presence on the enemy team. I'm talking 4 or even a full physical team to make Mannequin Scepter really useful. And even then, even in those circumstances, I would argue that probably War Flag or Animosity is going to be the better pick, even in that situation. Alright? That's just me. Now, I do want to talk about... I didn't talk about this much in the last episode, because a lot of my favorite assassins, and even a lot of assassins in general, don't necessarily need it, but if you're playing a hunter or a mage support, you're probably going to want to at least consider the Protector's Mask. Now, in this particular case with Danzaburou, he actually still can deal out decent damage because of the power boost from dubious savings and his unusually good ability scaling for a hunter. So I don't generally use this on him, personally. I haven't experimented much with this, so maybe this is just me not necessarily knowing Danzaburou as well, but I've never found this to be particularly useful. It's more been War Flag and Animosity for me. Alright, so we have that. And Danzaburou makes for a very strong support option if you're going to support as an ADC. Now, another suggestion I would like to offer to you, which I haven't seen in a couple of years, is Neith. Now, a lot of people are probably going to be confused or upset slightly, because a lot of people don't see her this way, but consider her actual abilities. We have Spirit Arrow, which is a straight line route unless you hit a weave, in which case it is an AoE route, which is unusually powerful, a la Terra. You have Unravel. Now, Unravel previously was just about good old healing herself. But now, it reduces enemy attack speed and increases her own. Again, if we're talking about an animosity build, this is really potentially very powerful. Or Chin Size as well, also really likes this. But it also reduces enemy attack speed. Now, this does make Neith a bit conditional in terms of her ability to support. The more auto-attackers on the enemy team, the better she's going to be, because of Unravel's ability to reduce attack speed by an actually impressive 30%. But, nevertheless, she can still provide a lot of support, even with debuffing the auto-attacks of non-auto-attackers, because everyone's just going to auto-attack while they're waiting for abilities to cool down, so why the hell not? Backflip, of course, not only drops a weave, but it's a slow. It also allows her, and actually encourages you as Neith, to really frontline a lot more than you maybe normally would as a hunter. This is something even Danzaburou doesn't have. Danzaburou doesn't have any abilities that necessarily reward being right in the front, but Backflip rewards Neith, because not only can it pull you out of a potentially ugly situation, but it slows people on the way out as well, which is something you want as a support. So this is actually kind of like, hey, if you want to play a really aggressive frontline Neith as a support, you can do that. Just Backflip out of there. Yes, Backflip is really predictable, I understand that, but you're also a support. It's not really about that. Finally, even her ult has a stun attached to it. So everything Neith does as well, just like with Danzaburou, she also has all of her abilities pulling off something supporty as a secondary effect. And again, unlike Danzaburou, she actually has an ability that specifically wants her to be as close as possible to the enemy. So personally, between Danzaburou and Neith, this might be just me having played Neith for a lot longer, obviously. But I personally prefer Neith. If I have to pick an ADC in the support role, I'm going to pick Neith in most cases. Partially, again, that's probably out of habit for me. She's the ADC that she's the hunter that I've used for the support role for a while whenever I need to do so, or whenever I just feel like to. But she's my go-to support hunter. Alright, not a whole lot of other hunters really have a ton of potential. Artemis, of course, has some. Transgressor's Fate is fairly nice as a root. Suppress the Insolent slows. The Boar obviously stuns. Vengeful Assault isn't really that useful for Artemis. Maybe you can cleanse a slow and keep up with enemies with it because of the movement speed boost, but generally I've never found this to be, particularly useful from a support role, to the point where I actually don't build this. I just go, when I do use this, I go Transgressor's Fate, Suppress the Innocent, and I just boost these, and then this is the last thing that goes up, even after ults. So, there is that. On her, actually, except for his ult, which basically just exists to give you CC immunity as a support. This is actually fairly interesting, because nobody really talks about this. Everyone knows that on her debuffs enemy physical protections. Everyone knows this, but nobody actually talks about how helpful that is in a team fight when your allied on her is flinging spears all over the place and reducing the entire enemy team's physical protections by a flat 20, which is a decent amount if the enemy is squishy. So on her contributes quite a lot, even if he doesn't mean to. This happens when he's playing ADC, but it's also really useful if you're a support. Now, this is the real point of Desert Fury as a support. Yes, you use it for CC immunity a lot of the times, but at the start of a team fight, this can be really useful to just Desert Fury and try to make sure you hit every enemy at least once. Reduce their physical protections a little bit, and then start going ham, right? Because Shifting Sands, yes, it only increases on her's basic attacks, which is a little bit unhelpful. But it does provide a slow, and it's something your allies can really rely on. Okay, this area is a slow for enemies. If you have Gilgamesh, Atlas, Sobek, Fenrir, they all can use that to their advantage. Impale, of course, is a push into a stun if they hit something. Disperse, of course, has the pop-up, right? So on her also makes, and I've never seen, I'm sorry, I've seen one once. I've only ever seen one support on her before, but he actually can play the role decently well. Besides that, there's not really any other... I suppose we should talk about Cupid. Cupid is interesting as a support, where you kind of have to go with the attack speed build. He actually is probably the only hunter here where I would choose War Flag over Animosity. Pretty consistently. And the reason why is because Love Struck, you need the 8 shots, you need the increased attack speed. Boom. The attack speed is for this stun. Is it a stun or is it a mez? Stunned. We have Share the Love for healing, which is fairly nice. Also keeps you in good mana if you heal an ally. Flutter. This is interesting, because the passive part of this you do want even as a support, because again you're trying to rack up those stuns with the Heart Bomb. But the active is actually fairly useful as well. If you and your allies are trying to rush to a jungle objective, or you're rushing to a tower after getting a deicide, Flutter makes not a huge difference, but a little bit of a difference. It can be the difference between taking the tower or taking the jungle camp and not. Don't underestimate Flutter. Surprisingly useful. And then we have Fields of Love, which of course is a mez with the slow and root. Now, my problem with Cupid is that a lot of people just see Cupid as, oh yeah, he's a heal bot in the support role. Well, no, not really. He actually makes for a surprisingly decent support. I mean, he has what he needs for that. He's got a variety of interesting effects that he can use to his advantage in that specific scenario. But beyond these very specific hunters, I wouldn't really recommend using or throwing a whole other bunch of hunters. Scotty, to some extent, that would take some practice. I haven't personally played it. I've seen it, again, once. I saw it last year once. Calder can tank some shots, I suppose, if you really want to use him that way, or body block for your ally if you position him correctly, which is very difficult because you need a target. But Piercing Cold does have a slow. This, of course, is bonus damage. Potentially tower, tanker. Permafrost, of course, is that slow with the slide, and then you have the root on Winter's Grasp. There is some potential here. I would need to experiment more actively with this and more aggressively with this before I can give you any... I don't want to, like, give you some kind of wrong impression. I have never played Scotty in the support role. I would want to sit down and practice with this before giving you some concrete advice on a build, but in theory, on paper, she does work in the role. I just don't know how well, but based on her kit, she stands a decent chance of doing fairly well in the role. Beyond those very specific points on these hunters, on hunters in general in the support role, I would just stick with the ones I talked about. The rest of them don't really do enough. Heimdall, for instance, only has crowd control on his ult, technically, and if the enemy has beads, that means nothing. Well, he's got the pop-up on the Yellerhorn, but it's not particularly impressive. It's not enough for a support role, right? But those would be the hunters that I would go to for this. And again, keep in mind that Chin Size or Animosity are particularly effective if you want to splash in some damage. And again, one other final reminder, Gauntlet of Thebes very rarely works on hunters because you really want to be taking advantage of that aggression that you offer as a hunter support. But let's talk about mages, because this is fairly interesting. I want to talk about Hades first, because Hades was originally a guardian. And he still is fairly effective in the role. We have a slow on Death from Above, Shroud of Darkness, which is a silence or a fear if they're afflicted by Blight. Devour Souls, which heals you and allies if they're standing close enough. That's a fun fact almost no one knows about. If you're standing... Unfortunately, you have to be standing almost right next to Hades, to be honest. You practically have to be one with Hades to get this heal, but you can be healed by Hades. Fun fact. And then Pillar of Agony, of course, the slow, the pull, the protection increase, the debuff on the enemy protections... Very, very unusually effective. Now, I do want to have a specific shout-out here. He is abnormally good with Voidstone and Mystical Mail, because Voidstone obviously is going to reduce those magic protections even more, but Mystical Mail, you're already reducing their magic protections. Why not take advantage of that with some extra damage out of Mystical Mail? Alright? He is also, incidentally, decently effective with Pridwin as well. And again, I just want to emphasize that for a majority of mages that you play in the support role, if you choose to do so, Gauntlet of Thebes is once again going to be too slow. Even with Hades, it's too slow. Now that he's a mage, his base stats have been changed, and he needs protections, and he needs them yesterday. Alright, that's just how it goes. As for mages that I would recommend for support, I'm going to actually talk about a match I had this morning, where there was an Anubis support. And that didn't really work out for the enemy team a lot of the time, and if your response is, well, that's because he only has one crowd control, that was half of it. He does have Mummify, but that wasn't the only problem with Anubis in the support role. The second problem is for half of his kit, literally the Plague of Locusts and Death Gaze, he's stationary. Now, as a support Anubis, you don't have to worry so much about dying. What you do have to worry about is not being in the area when your allies are getting into a fight and you're just standing there either belching locusts or shooting rays out of your eyes, neither of which are going to do anything supporty or crowd control. It's just doing damage. And as a support Anubis, you're not really doing that damage. And you might look at the low scaling on these, 15%, 40%. You might think, well, yeah, he can get away with being a support and still doing damage. Pardon me. But what you forget is that this is a multi-hit ability, and while it's only 15 or 40%, depending on the ability, or let's just throw Grasping Hands in there, 35%, it's so many hits in a row that actually really stacks up, right? Anubis is a great example of what you don't want in a support. He's too slow, he's immobile for half of his kit, and he only has one crowd control. Now, I've talked about Aphrodite in the role before. It is one of my favorite ways to play Aphrodite. You do have the Kiss. This is not only a stun if you hit enemies, but if you are linked to an ally, they get an increase in damage, right up to 20 stinking %, which is pretty huge. And you give them increased mana regeneration. She's slept on as a support, honestly. In this meta, at least. In this meta, you can get away with it because early aggression can typically lead to snowballs, so if you get that early game aggression, which is why Gauntlet of Thebes is becoming decreasingly unpopular nowadays, is actually because the meta does somewhat reward early aggression, so people want that early aggression, and Aphrodite is actually pretty good at this. So you have Kiss, you've got Back Off, which is a nice pushback, which is a really great time. Lovebirds, of course, heals. And then finally, Undying Love gives your ally total immunity. It's a really lovely time, and also finally, this is also something that not a lot of people know about, Center of Attention, bonus protections, yes please. She actually makes for one of the stronger supports in the mage class, and honestly, while I've been talking pretty extensively about how, early game aggression is really good, and, Gauntlet of Thebes doesn't necessarily work, Gauntlet of Thebes might work on her, if you're in communication with your ADC and you both know what you're doing. Alright, under those conditions, that's fine. But if you're with randoms, I wouldn't take the risk. Okay? Just putting that out there. She could, if you know the person you're with. But I would still treat it with some caution. Now, I've seen a lot of people try very hard to get Baron Sammy to work as a support, and he can work as a support. The problem is you have to play him slowly. He still can't really use Gauntlet of Thebes, which is the real problem right now. But you do have to play it slowly, because right here, Vivid Gaze, if the enemy god is above 30 Hysteria, their power and attack speed are reduced. Really impressive. But you have to get the Hysteria up, and that takes time. You can't just go in there guns blazing and expect to do what you think you're going to do, because the power and attack speed reduction only happens when they're in Hysteria. You only increase allies' movement speed when the enemy's in Hysteria. I mean, it's still a fine heal otherwise. Wrap it up as an AoE slow to root if the enemy is over 30 Hysteria. Right? This is a stun pull, which, again, if they're over 30 Hysteria, the pull strength is higher. It's a much slower game, okay? You have this really weird position with a support Baron Sammy where you want the early game aggression because you have the damage output. You're a stinking mage. You have the damage output there. But you also have to play it slow, so you even though you have an aggressive kit, you want to play it slow so you can build up the Hysteria, and then when you see the little skulls above your enemies, that's when you go in guns blazing, and that's the problem a lot of people have when they try to play Baron Samedi support. They just see mage support, and they just go in there like a lunatic, not having built up the hysteria first. It's very important for a support Baron Samedi to build up the hysteria first. So you basically want to do it in, you want to establish a sort of rhythm to it. Alright, go slow, build the hysteria. Okay, hysteria built, go in, slap them down. Pull back, more hysteria. You gotta create a rhythm here. And a lot of people don't do that. Either because they don't know to do that, they simply don't know how to make a rhythm out of that, or alternatively, they're just way too aggressive, or possibly they simply are just caught off guard by something and they panic and they just lose their whole train of thought. He can work, but you have to do it carefully. Now, I mentioned Shangha technically being able to do it, do support. She's okay at it. I just wanted to mention kind of that she only really technically has, in terms of supportiness, a dance instead of a kickflip like Ravon's, and the healing Moonflower dance, and the stun on Waxing Moon. There really isn't a whole lot to Chang'e to make her a good support, unfortunately. That's just the way it is. Iset I want to actually shout out because she's almost really good at the role. I mean, you have Funeral Rites, which gives all of your allies increased HP and MP5. You have a really great stun on the Spirit Ball, a nice long-distance stun, incidentally. Dispel Magic, which is a protection debuff. It's a silence. It gives allies shields if they're close enough. It slows. You have Circle of Protection, increases damage mitigation. It heals your allies. It's a really lovely time. Wing Gust isn't that great from a support standpoint. And there's nothing you can do about that. It's just basically dead weight. Yes, it does some damage. Yes, you can use it to keep up with an enemy. These are all relatively minor things. Yeah, it's nice and all, but it's not... It doesn't do anything else, really, beyond as an approach or an escape, and is just some random damage. Again, if you want to splash in a little bit of damage, but you want to be, nice and aggressive in the early game, Iset might be for you. I see a lot of people play Nox as a support. Yes, Shadow Lock is good. Yes, Siphon Darkness is a silence. This is a root. This is damage reduction and some damage. She's okay at it in the same way. She's okay at it in the exact same way that Iset is. They both have this one ability that basically just exists to do damage, and then the rest of their abilities are really good from a support standpoint. It's just the way it is. Now, Hell is also fairly interesting from a support standpoint, and I've seen people use her, and I've seen people use her well. I've used her very well in the role. It's one of my favorite ways of playing her. You give allies increased healing. You give allies increased protections in the light mode. This heals all your allies. You also have the good old dark side, which is just damage. You have the damage out of decay, but you have the heal, the self-heal, along with the ally heal on the light, and then you can cleanse allies from CC, which gives them the ability to build something other than beads, and it removes slows. It's a really lovely thing, and it also reduces enemy protections if you're in the dark mode. It's a really lovely time. She does a lot that supports, but what if I told you she was also pretty good with Gem of Isolation? Not only does the dark mode have Repulse, which basically allows you to slap down a giant AoE slow, but Decay is also fairly impressive as well from a slowing standpoint. And then finally, if you use Restoration, the light stance version of this ability, on an enemy, instead of healing them, it'll do damage, and guess what? Now you've also got them slowed. So, she's slept on right now as a support. But just keep that in mind. Beyond that, other characters I would actively utilize from the support role. Poseidon, actually, especially if you're using Animosity, because guess what? Trident triggers multiple Animosities. Okay? Because those are... His basic attacks fire 2 additional shots. Those trigger Animosity. At least the last time I checked, they did. Maybe they changed it in the most recent update, or in an update that I wasn't paying attention to, but as far as I checked was a week ago, those trigger. If I'm wrong, I'll put it in the description. But the last time, like I said, the last time I checked, Trident triggers Animosity for each individual shot. So, boom. Yes, you have a lovely time there. Was it a week ago that I played this? Hold on. We can actually test this right now. I'm pretty sure they trigger. There we go. I'm pretty sure. Let me run this real quick. I'm not gonna stand up and give you false information when I can just straight up test it. Where did Poseidon go? I went too far down. Why am I having a brain cramp? Here he is. I'm not gonna stand up and just give you false information. Let me double check this real quick. I'm pretty stinking sure the triple shots each individually provide an animosity stack. I have to hit level 20 first, though, which is just that little area there. Yep, here, that's lovely. Might as well raise that all the way.
Minions have spawned.
No, it does not. Alright. Good thing I checked. It does not. That's interesting, because... Oh, there we go. It just takes a little while. Because actually, Zonqui's, and this is... Let me go back in there, because I want to show you Zonqui, because Zonqui is interesting, where his does trigger the second proc. And this actually makes Zonqui unusually good at animosity builds. He also has a stun and a self-heal. He has... his passive increases his protections, and when he's using his ult, he gets 40 baseline. I think it's 40 still. It might have changed. I'll have to check really quick. Last time I checked, it was 40 protections when he had a full bag, and that doubled when he was using his ults. Is it still 40? Max stacks 40 protections, 1. Yes, it still is 40. All right. Yo, we gotta go to 20 here. I mean, Poseidon's still a good support because he's got the Kraken pop-up, he's got the Whirlpool Crippling Pull, he's got the push out of the wave. So he's still a really good support. Unless I change this. No, see, you can see the 52 there? That is the animosity trigger on the second shot. So, despite the fact that Zonqui's second shot triggers animosity, Poseidon's does not anymore. Which, I'm not surprised, ESET's used to as well. A long time ago. Not animosity specifically, but it used to trigger multiple basic attacks. Then they changed it, and I suspect that they probably changed Poseidon's as well. So Poseidon's does not multi-proc animosity, but Zonqui's does. Both are still very good at the support role. Now, someone that I haven't seen in the support role, despite the fact that he actually does it decently well, is Hwang, because he's got protection reduction here on the flames. The root shot, Dao Cultivation, I'm not really sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but this is a slow/root. He has Celestial Flight, which when he lands faster, he actually has knockback on it, and then the Dueling Dragons as a push or a pull, depending on how you arrange this. So he's actually surprisingly very useful in the support role as well. Ra, I hear about a lot. I don't like him in the support role. Yes, Solar Blessing is great supportively, increases allied power, allied protections. He's got his slow on Divine Light, and that's all he's got. Celestial Beam is just damage, which again, that's 100% scaling, but you're a support, you're not building that much power. Same thing with Searing Pain. Yeah, that's 100% scaling, sure, but you're a support Raw, you don't build that much power. So I don't really like him in the support role personally. Same thing with Scylla. Actually, a lot of these I just don't like in the support role because they really don't bring enough to the table. Morgana, I also don't feel like does either. I've tested her in the role once, so I did abysmal. She just doesn't do enough, and the Sigil is nice. The Dragonflight is nice. This really doesn't do anything for this. It's just... She doesn't do enough from a support standpoint for me to really be comfortable using her in that role. But overall, I would say these would be the mages that I would go to by default for your supporting. I do want to actually put a brief, sort of one last addendum here, very specifically for Baba Yaga. She is weird where technically she could be supportive because the wild witchcraft can be a whole bunch of different effects. It can be silences, boosting allies, slowing enemies. Baba's Brew, which we have potential for. Look at this. We have slows. We have attack speed and power reductions. We have Blast Off, which is damage mitigation. We have Home Sweet Home, which is a pop-up near enemies. It is a health shield. It is Creeping Fire. She also plays unusually well with Gem of Isolation, but you do have to be careful. You have to really know her, because Wild Witchcraft is, of course, randomized, so you never know specifically what effect until it happens. Like, it tells you what your next effect is going to be, but how you need to use that is a totally different question. Now, I can and have played her decently well in the support role before. Again, not my favorite mage for support, but I have done it before, and I can do it again. It's surprisingly better than you'd think, especially with Gem of Isolation along for the ride. But you have to know her really well. This is actually something, this is a mage support where I'm going to actually say, unless you're a Baba Yaga main already, you're going to have to take the time to practice this, okay? To actually get this, to get good enough with it to where you're going to be like, okay, so I've got this buff here, or I've got this debuff on my Wild Witchcraft, so I can use it here, and I can trigger this effect. Like, a number of times where this is just the easiest example to generate, but one time I was in a match, I was bot bag, and I was, bot bag is the family name for her, by the way. I was bot bag, and I was playing support for kicks. And the enemy solo laner was a Hercules, and we were doing fairly well, and then the mid-game comes. Our solo lane had been losing to this Hercules. I don't remember who our solo laner was, but for most of the match, from the mid-game onwards, when Hercules started showing up in mid-lane, I was able to use the silence part. Whenever it came up, I would use the silence on him and try to surround him with it or whatever. You can see the shape, usually trying to cut him off from allies, because even if he pulled them in, as long as I had enough swamp there, he couldn't make that work, right? So overall, hold on, what's this noise I'm hearing? No, I don't know what that was. That was weird. Anyways, so overall, she can be very effective in the role, but you have to understand how Wild Witchcraft works, and that's going to take a little bit of practice first. So be very careful with it, okay? Just respect the Baba Yaga support. Beyond that, a lot of these, when you're playing, I talked about how some Guardians do really well with Spear of the Magus as their final item, and or Soul Reaver, depending on the situation. Mage supports do that way better. All right. There are a couple of exceptions. I don't build Soul Reaver or Spear of the Magus on Aphrodite, for instance. For her, typically it'll be a Rod of Asclepius, as an example. But Poseidon, fantastic. Do you know how devastating it is for a support Poseidon to roll up on you, whirlpool you? Now you've got Spear of the Magus on you, slaps you with a wave. You take extra damage, even though it's not much, and then his ally comes flying in. You're stuck in a whirlpool, taking 7.5% increased damage from all sources. You're doomed. Alright, just as an example. Or Baron Samedi. He's using his coffin, he's using the big suck. Brings you in. The instant you get hit by that first damage point, now you're taking 7.5% increased damage. Not only will Baron Samedi be hitting you harder, but anybody hitting you on your way into the suck, boom, bonus damage, right? Spear of the Magus is incredibly potent on a lot of these mage supports that I've been talking about. Incredibly potent. Okay? Hades, with a Spear of the Magus as his final item, using that ult, ooh, that gets ugly very quickly. Very quickly. It's just a matter of how you want to approach it. There's nothing wrong with playing, even the mages that I didn't mention here, there's nothing wrong with trying to play them in the support role, but again, my old watchword is, if you can do it better with something else, why not do it with the something else? The mages I've outlined here are what I've discovered through personal experience to be particularly good in the support role and can actually play a mean support. They changed how Poseidon's auto-attacking with his Trident changed from how I thought it used to be. Again, he and E-Set had to change at some point. I remember the E-Set changing because at the time that changed, I was playing a mean auto-attacking E-Set in mid lane way back then. That was, I want to say that was 3 or 4 years ago. I don't know when they changed Poseidon's Trident, but it used to be 3 hits. And those 3 hits would have triggered animosity, just like Zhonghui's. But no love lost for the lost builds of yesteryear. Anyways, with that being said, I hope this gives you some ideas on how to better approach this. Again, final reminder, don't build Gauntlet of Thebes. You don't have the baseline protections to make that work. You will have a really rough time. You have, as a hunter or a mage support, you have really good early game damage. Use it. Apply that pressure. Try your damnedest to snowball, because that's going to help your team out a lot more. Even if at the end game you stop getting kills, which is fine. In the early game, if you even with certain assassin supports, you grab a couple of kills in the early game, that's not a big deal. Okay? You can use that to extend your damage period into the mid game. But come late game, you really want to be helping your allies out a lot more than just trying to chase kills or whatever. So just kind of keep that in mind. Don't go really wild with it. Just, like I said, respect it. But these can work really well. I suppose I should talk about Soul really quick, actually, because she does play really well with the Animosity build. Radiance does heal her. That's 25% of her missing health over 5 seconds as a support. Again, I can't speak. As a support, that can get to be quite a substantial heal. 25% of 3,000 health is not a bad shake. Stellar Burst is a slow, of course. Disapparate actually has the... It's kind of like a slower version of Ravon's Kickflip. Use that information how you will. And then finally we have Supernova, which is, of course, the knockback. The only real issue is that Unstable Manifestation, if you're not using Animosity, this can get a little bit meaningless without Animosity. So anytime I play Soul support, and I've only done it twice so far, but at the time I knew Soul really well, Animosity, devastating on her. Have a nice day. But I wouldn't really go any farther than that, and even then, a lot of the time, a lot of your supporting is going to be basically body blocking in your Solar Radiance, because actually, the interesting thing with Radiance here is you can use this a lot like the Bamboo Forest from Danzaboru, but instead of reducing basic attack damage, you're just healing yourself. It's a really interesting time. It can be very effective if your ally is cooperative, and again, I want to also point out the fact that if you're partied up with someone and you're in verbal communication with them, these become a lot more effective. The difference between playing a soul support with a random and them, say, wandering away from your radiance so you don't heal while body blocking, compared to someone you're in conversation with and you can say to them, hey, look, just box it out with them. I'll stand between you two and I'll just throw down my radiance and body block for you. That's a totally different conversation, because you can't necessarily guarantee that a random is going to listen to you, but a friend that you're partied with is so much more likely to actually listen to you and get it done and actually deal that damage that you need them to do for you. And that is a huge difference. Again, Poseidon, same thing. You can actually verbally tell your ally, hey, look, I'm going to whirlpool, I'm going to crack it, I'm going to lock him down. You just sweep in and just blast him with whatever. It's harder to tell that to a random ally because you have to type it out. Alright, so just keep that in mind, that if these seem kind of sketchy to you because you're used to regular supports or whatever, or if you're a mid-main or an ADC main, you're kind of like, well, aren't they a little too squishy for that? Possibly. It is riskier. Even with randoms, it can work, but all of these definitely work a lot better with a friend. So if you have a friend to grab, or you, ideally, in a perfect world, I know not everyone has people they play with all the time. I play with my family pretty consistently, So I have someone to play this, to play that role with, and I can actually verbally communicate with. Not everyone has that. But if you do have someone who is willing to smite with you in the duo lane, and they're willing to let you be a crazy support like Poseidon support, Soul support, Baron Samedi support, that's the way to at least practice it. So that way, when you get into playing with randoms with this, and they start doing really wild things, you at least have the awareness of how to better play that character in the support role and be able to adapt a little bit better to the insanity that randoms tend to bring. Alright? That's all I'm really going to say here. I will do another episode. It'll probably be a lot shorter because I'll want to talk about very specific builds. Hyper-specific builds. And characters they're particularly good on. But that's, like I said, that's for a future episode. So thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.